Fantastic. So thank you for joining and welcome again here to our eymeets session on Wednesday, 22nd of October 2025. This session specifically is looking at understanding or explaining how we help you meet the DfE guidance for invoicing that was announced earlier in the year, where you've got the January 26th deadline, but we want to support you meeting that ASAP. And when we think about meeting this guidance, we're really thinking about how we customize the EY Manage software within our platform for this purpose, as that's the child financials part of our system. I'll be the host of the session today. Again, my name's Tim Taylor. I'm head of growth here at eyworks. I joined the company back in 2016, so coming up for 10 years now, and seen a lot of changes in the sector. This is the biggest one really in terms of invoicing, of course, to support the funding changes that came in previously with the rollout of the 30 hours across the different age ranges. So the aim of the session really is to make sure you're all aware in terms of the customizations available here on EY Manage to allow your invoices to be compliant with your local authority and with this guidance. And we'll take you through that process this morning. As I touched upon just before popping the call on to record, we've disabled microphones and videos on this call due to the volume of attendees. But feel free to send a question in the chat if you do have a query or want something detailed in a bit more context. We'll try and get through those questions as we go. It might be we come back to you after the call if we're unable to pick that one up for you. So let's first of all think about what the actual requirements are in terms of the information that you're expected to now display or show on an invoice from January at the latest to parents attending or whose children are attending your setting for care. When the DfE announced this guidance earlier in the year, they were clarifying that the aim for invoices is to have a clear breakdown of and separation of funded hours versus additional charged hours, have a separate itemization or breakout of any food or other consumable charges that might be being billed as well. So that from the parent's perspective, there's clear transparency in terms of what they're receiving funded or in some local terms free, errantly named as free, what they're being billed for in terms of attendance, and what they're being charged for in terms of extras at the setting or part of that attendance itself. Now, what we found is when speaking to customers, different local authorities seem to have interpreted this guidance in different ways. And so what we'll look to show you today is not just how we can segment these elements onto the invoices for you, but also how you can edit and adjust the item names and the descriptions to meet maybe the requirements that your local authority are then pushing onto yourselves. When we think about those 5 breakout areas, funded hours, additional charged hours, food, consumable, and activity charging, the DfE did give some guidance in terms of what they expect to be categorized under these headlines, sections, or names. So when we think about funded hours here in the system, and the session we'll run through today, we're of course talking about the number of funded hours, government funded hours, accessed by the child within an invoice period. Naturally, a lot of your children will be attending more hours than their funding entitlement, and so we need to be able to display the additional charged hours, any privately paid hours accessed on top of or in addition to the funded entitlement. Common scenario there is a child might be attending 4 or 5 days in the week, but only have funding, of course, across 2 or 3 of those days, depending on their eligibility. So there'll always be a chargeable additional hour element in there. We also want to look at how we can break out these food and consumable costs. Now, we've grouped them into these 3 categories as per the guidance: food, non-food, extra activities for this table here. But we have had stories of different local authorities asking for more breakdown and detail. We'll show you how you can segment maybe the non-food consumables in a clearer way if required. But again, for the purpose of this table, what we're seeing here in terms of food charge is any charge for food, the meal, snacks, etc., that you might provide. But these are optional charges or voluntary charges, as sometimes referred to. So again, what we'll look to show you is not just how we can set those up in terms of a billable element, but how you can manage the opt-out of that food charge where need be. The non-food consumable charges linked to items like your nappies, wipes, sun cream maybe that you provide. Now, of course, some of you might already allow parents to provide their own version of these, especially if there's an allergy-related element for, say, sun cream, sensitive skin, etc. But these charges, if they are being billed again in the guidance, suggested as optional or voluntary charges that the parent can choose to opt out of. So again, we'll show you that opt-out management on the system. And then you've got those extra activity charges. Now, quite high level, this was identified as charges for anything offered beyond the provision of EYFS. So it can be things like forest school, French lessons, maybe yoga. Those external activities, extra activities you might charge, trips maybe. Again, identified as optional or voluntary, but can't exclude children in certain ways. Now, the key thing that we're talking about here is obviously really that transparency. That's the aim really of this guidance change. And these 5 settings or sections of an invoice are a good starting point. Again, your local authority might require you to break some of these down in more breakdown detail, maybe. And we'll talk through that process this morning. But the key thing for you guys to take away just from this screen is that EY Manager already gives you the flexibility to meet these 5 areas or segments of an invoice, separating out funded hours versus charged hours versus those consumable charges that you might have. We also allow you to support opt-out management. And typically when we think about opt-outs, it's often seen as the parents opting out of a charge. But it might also be that you as a nursery choose to opt certain children out from that charge as well. So, for example, we've seen a lot of nurseries already ask us the question around how they can internally opt out children maybe accessing 2-year-old disadvantage funding from being billed those food or non-food or extra activity charges. But of course, whether it's a parent opting out of a single one of these charges, whether it's you as a nursery looking to opt out a group of children, maybe based on funding stream from one or all of the charges, EY Manager already supports that. So we'll talk you through that process again this morning. And the way that we've built this process is to try and automate as much of this segmentation as possible. So whether it's a single nursery where you're looking for consistency across the children within that single setting, or a group on the call where you're looking for consistency across all of your settings. We're looking to provide this as a system setup so that you have that confidence that every invoice generated will follow a similar structure, rather than the manager having 3 or 4 different invoice structures they're working with within a single nursery for different opt-outs or similar. So I'm sure you're all aware of these key info breakdowns, so we're not going to linger here for too long. But what we're going to look to show you next is how these elements can fit within the invoice structures offered within the EY Managed system. But before we look at how they work on an invoice, it's really important to cover the invoice options that are available to you on the EY Managed platform. Some of you maybe are using one or both of the invoice methods we already offer. Of course, it might be that you're using a combination within the setting. But the key things to consider here is that within EY Manage, we have 2 compliant invoice models available for you, both of which support the transparency requirements from the DfE shown on the previous slide. The difference here really relates to how you want to bill your families for the attendance and the care at your setting. And the key thing to consider here is that even though we see most customers use one or the other of these 2 options, we do give you flexibility where you can have some children on each of the different invoice models if required. Just for clarity purposes, let's run through these invoice options in a bit of detail, starting with the actual session invoicing on the left-hand side table that we see. With actual invoices, you've got the option here to generate invoices on a weekly, a monthly, or a termly period. And the invoices generated in that structure are based on the actual sessions scheduled against the child's profile within the billable period. So, of course, if you're working on a strict calendar date month invoice basis, what that means is there could be a different number of Tuesdays billed in one month versus the next month, because it simply follows the calendar. And we're looking at the actual sessions booked. In the case of October, October started on Wednesday, the 1st of October. So in this month, assuming the child is attending in the half-term week, of course, there are 5 Wednesdays: the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, 22nd, 29th, versus only 4 Tuesdays. So with actual session invoicing, we're looking solely at the invoice period and what's booked within that period itself. We do have some nurseries who, for their monthly invoicing, rather than work on a calendar date, they work on full invoice weeks. So the invoice period would be the 4 or 5 weeks in length. So you always have a full week to avoid that scenario of 5 Wednesdays and 4 Tuesdays I just provided. This invoice method is ideal for nurseries on the call looking to charge the parents exactly for what's booked, so that you're never in advance or in arrears in terms of what the parents should have paid for the care to that point. They're paying for what's obviously booked in and therefore scheduled. And of course, from the invoice perspective, what that gives when we think about the actual sessions being presented on the invoice is a clear identifier for the parents that they're being billed for what they've attended. Really transparent there. When we think about actual session invoicing, funded hours are always itemised on the invoice on the weekly basis within those invoice periods. So each week we're going to show how many funded hours the child is accessing. So when we think about that previous slide, we'd be able to show not just the funded hours access, but also, therefore, the charged hours on top, the additional private hours in that way. But one thing that we do offer on an actual session invoice is the option to itemize the food, consumable, or extra activity costs, which is what a lot of our customers do, or annualize them based on funded hours rather than on a per day attendance basis. And we'll show you that now. So to give some context here for that actual invoice structure, let's just come out of the presentation for a moment and switch across to the system where I've got 2 invoices created in preparation for today's call for you. Both of these are actual session invoices. And if we scroll down this invoice here, look to start with on the 1st October to 5th of October period, that Wednesday to Sunday week. What we can see here is a typical actual session invoice structure on eyworks. The child booked on a full day session, in our case an eymeets full day session, and on that first week we can see it was attended on the Wednesday and the Thursday. So they were in the setting for 20 hours. Of those 20 hours, 16 of the hours were funded, 4 of the hours were charged. So on this week, the parents are being billed for 4 hours at the session cost, so they're being billed £40 for that session attendance. If we scroll down to the second week of October, which is a full Monday to Sunday week, you can see we now have attendance on the Tuesday displayed as well. So now there's 30 hours in attendance. Funded hours remain the same. We've got a chargeable quantity here. Now, with this structure, you can see that on each of the weeks, we're then showing the products accessed. In this case, we've just done food for this example, but this is a breakdown of breakfast, lunch, tea, so those food breakdowns is required. In this scenario, we can itemize the products based on the attended days or the scheduled days. So we can see that the child here is being billed for 3 breakfasts at a cost per breakfast, a cost per week. On that first week of the month, there's only 2 of those charges because of the fact that Tuesday is a non-October day that fell into September's bill. So when we think about an actual session invoice, we often see products itemized in this way based on the days of attendance. But what we've also started to offer and what we've started to see if we switch across to our second actual session invoice option is the session element is the same, but maybe the consumables are being calculated and charged in a different way. So rather than being linked on a per day basis, they might be related to the funded hours that the child is attending on that period. Now, on this example, I've highlighted what the cost is for each of those products, those consumables within the description. But effectively, we're saying here, if we look at the consumable charge, it's £1 per funded hour, as there are 16 funded hours on this week, they therefore charge £16 for that consumable. If we were to scroll down onto week 2, where of course there were 3 days of attendance, there's more funding, so therefore the charge is greater because it's £1 per funded hour in that way. Now, in both of these invoice examples, if we come back to our previous slide, we're highlighting here the month period because we show the to and from dates, or from and to dates, sorry, on the invoice. We're basing the charge on the actual sessions booked with a breakdown of funded hours, 16 hours against the 20 attended, and charged hours, 4 hours of the 20 attended. And we've got those two options for products. Itemised, based on the actual days, so on week 1 of October, just on the Wednesday and Thursday. On week 2, the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, or more of an annualised or automated charge based on the funded hours, say. Now, that works for some nurseries, of course. What it does lead to is often a variable charge month on month. So naturally, we see a lot of our customers invoice parents on an equal spread invoicing mechanism instead. Because what this gives you is, of course, a consistent monthly amount for the parents to pay, because you're spreading the cost of the attendance and the charge across, of course, a defined period, billable period, typically 12 months. It could be 11 months, of course, depending on the nursery. The key thing with equal spread invoicing is it is monthly invoice periods only. And the element here is that we're going to calculate an annual charge, which we split into equal payments, as I explained. Now, the difference here is that when we think about funded hours used, we're not able to itemize the funded hours week by week on the invoice front page. So we present a monthly funded hours total. How many funded hours were used by that child within that month period? Alongside that, you'll see in a moment, we also therefore show a charged hours total as well. Again, we can bill the food, the consumables, the extra activities on an annualized basis, or they can also be itemized on an equal spread option. Because of the fact that equal spread billing is more of an annualized, an average charge, equal payment charge, we do also give an option to add some more transparency for parents in terms of how that bill is being calculated. And we'll show you this structure now. Because the aim of these invoices is, of course, to meet compliance, but also to ensure that your charges are correct. So we want you to be able to calculate the bill appropriately, but meet those local authority requirements for transparency purpose. So let's look at scenario 1 here. This is our invoice first page. As we can see, what we're showing is within the period of October, there were 35 hours that were charged versus 95 hours that were funded. Funded hours here show 0, so we're showing costs solely on that charged hours line. We have those same 3 food, consumable, extra activity charges as you saw on the previous actual session invoice, with the same charging points. The difference is this is being totaled to a whole year value and split across the 12 invoice months in my case. So we can see it's still related to the funded hours in the month, but not on the week basis as the actual session was. If we scroll down onto page number 2, I've enabled every piece of information we can on this example invoice for today's call. But you can show to parents elements such as what week the invoice was based from, the booking pattern or attendance pattern scheduled for that week. So we can see things such as chargeable hours, funded hours. In our case, how many weeks we charge the session attendance cost over versus how many weeks we charge or deduct, provide funding over. So we're trying to give this option of transparency so that when the parents are looking at this first page, which is the summary really of what the invoice total is, they've got that secondary page to support them in understanding how we've arrived at those figures. The secondary version of equal spread is, though, the option to itemize the consumable charges. Now, when we think about itemizing consumable charges on an equal spread invoice, of course, it means that part of the invoice is based on an equal split of charge across the year, and that would be the charged hours and the funded hours element. But it means that the consumable charges you then bill would vary based on the month in question. So again, like on the actual session invoice, I just used food here rather than the extra activities, the non-consumables, etc., just to avoid having lots of lines to show you today. But what we can see here is that with the breakfast, the lunch, the tea charge, it's identified there are 14 days of attendance for this child in the period. And that's based on that 1st of October to 31st of October month. That's the count of Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays in that period itself. 5 Wednesdays, 5 Thursdays, 4 Tuesdays, arriving at 14 days worth of charge. So when we think about the invoicing options, we're trying to give you those two models, actual session or equal spread, so that depending on your nursery specifically, you've got that choice of whether you want a system of charging based on session or cost predictability to parents per month for budget purpose. And revenue and cash flow from your side, of course, as well. But in both scenarios, with that breakdown, we offer the flexibility for you to show charged additional private hours, funded hours, and those consumable charges as segmented lines on the invoice to meet that DfE guidance or requirement. So you've seen the invoice options. Let's look and talk through now how we set these up on the system so that you've got the ability to go away and consider how or what changes you would like to make, if any, on the system itself. We'll start with the two actual session invoice options that we ran through. So scenario 1, where we're charging products based on a booked or scheduled basis. Scenario 2, where we're basing it maybe off our funded hours in more of an automated calculation purpose or process. So let's turn our attention to the system at this stage. Everyone here on the call is an eyworks customer, so the likelihood is you're aware of some of these settings already. So if we access our system settings and turn our attention to invoices payments, the likelihood is that you've already visited this screen at some point to choose your generation method. Do we want to bill on the actual sessions model or the equal spread model? If you're looking to bill on an actual session basis, of course, it's just key that you set the generation type here as actual sessions. That would cascade onto the children's profiles directly. In terms of the charging of those lines for food, for non-food, for extra activities, that's all managed within then our products and services area. And typically we found this is the area of the system where nurseries have had to make the largest change or tweak to their current process to meet the guidance required. I'm going to search here for products named or including the name eymeets to find the examples that we created here for the session today. Let's think first of all about the itemized product setup. These are the products where you can see in the description I referenced the cost as a per day charge. We'll look at breakfast to start with here. When we think about this type of charging, i.e. where we want to effectively bill the parents on each day of attendance or of funding access where this product's being charged, we want to have a per day cost. We can define our product name and set a description of choice, of course. Key thing to consider there is the name and the description will display on the invoice. So this is where you can add as much context as required. In my case, I broke down breakfast, lunch, and tea as separate meals. You might simply have a charge for food wrapped in, of course. We've set the price element here. That's a per day price in this scenario because we're saying this is a flat rate charge of 20p in this scenario. So every time we book or schedule this product, we're going to add 20p's worth of charge on that particular day. Let's come to our children view and take that product in mind. Search for children. And again, we'll filter here to find children named eymeets. In our case, we're looking at the actual invoicing element first of all. And we'll jump straight to their booking schedule so we can see this in action on screen. What you'll find if you're looking to charge a product, food, non-food extra activities on a per day basis. So rather than it being based on funded hours in a more annualized automated way, if you're doing it per day, when you're booking the attendance pattern of the child or editing a pattern that's already there, you'll find that towards the bottom of the screen, there's a product selection view. So if we were saying that this child was attending our eymeets full day session every week on certain days, as a manager, as a user on the system, you can choose which days that product's being charged on. Now, you can have different selections for different days. So, for example, if a parent has opted out of breakfast on these or food on a day, but they're accepting a charge for extra activities, you've got the control point here of a manual opt-out per child by not selecting the product. When viewing the child schedule, you'll be able to see exactly which products are being billed because they'd be displayed on the schedule here. So again, if a parent looked to opt out in the future, you would simply navigate from their schedule here to the future point, i.e. where that opt-out agreement comes into effect. Double click on the existing booking pattern and you could remove those products as required. So if you're billing on an actual sessions basis and you're looking to itemize those product costs, very much two-step process. Step one being the product setup and the definition of the cost per day for that product. Step two, scheduling that product against the child profile here as part of their schedule. Now, one thing that you can do to help or aid you with that process is when thinking about the sessions that you offer, if the product is charged by default in this method, rather than having to rely on your manager, owner, user, having to select that product manually, once you've defined the product and charging system, you can go to the session types area, edit the session type that you have, and link that product directly against the session itself. So that every time we book this eymeets 4-day session, the food charge, the non-food, the extra activities charge would be automatically booked as well. Let's show that in practice, because of course with this, you can still manage opt-out of children on that process. If we go back to our schedule view for our child, click back on that Monday, and now select that eymeets session, you'll find that that breakfast charge gets added automatically. If the child or the parent had opted out of that charge, you would then be able to untick where required. Rather than putting the emphasis on the user selecting the product, that would be auto-selected, you tick or untick to opt out. So itemized product charging on an actual session bill, really simple to manage. However, what we've started to see when we think about the children layouts and the invoice layouts is some form of automation of these food and consumable charges to take away that pressure on a system user to ensure the products are selected directly. When we've seen people go down this route of charging, typically it's been based on a cost per funded hour, although we can do it based on different time points in the day as well. And this is what we call an automated product charging method. Let's look at this setup now. Slightly different from the first scenario we looked at. Of course, from the system settings perspective, your invoice payment setting would still be for actual session bill. The difference, again, solely related to your product and service line. And if we search here for eymeets products once more, we can take our food charge example here. And let's edit this line. When we think about automated product charging in this way, again, the name and description of the product is customizable. You can name that as you wish. But what we've done here is we've selected that rather than charging a flat rate per day, which we need to attribute to the schedule, we want to now allow the system to automatically charge this rate for us. We'll look as per this product setup right now, as per a formula breakdown, because when we think about this formula breakdown, what we can look to do with you is define a charging model. In my case here, it's based on a charge per funded hour. So we've simply said that our weekly funded hours is times £1.50 per hour. The blue box here underneath explains how this formula can be written and some of the formula functions that we support. But if we were to think about writing something out ourselves from scratch here, much like on things like email templates where you might have used mail merge functions before, you can use 2 square brackets to select a charging point. So it might be a charge per scheduled hour, it might be a charge per funded hour as we set up here. And then we can start to bring in the multiplication, so times £1.50. Now, the key thing with your multiplication is this is like an Excel formula. So it'd be your star for multiplication, / for division, etc. Not a X on the screen. What this would look to do is every time you bill an invoice for a child on that actual sessions method, the system's looking then at how many funded hours the child is accessing from the setting in that given week. And based on your charging model, in our case, 16 hours, for food, we're doing 16 times 1.5 to add £24 worth of charge. For consumable, £1 per hour, 16 times 1. And for our extra activity charge, I set that as 50p, 16 times 0.5. And that ensures that based on your funding input, that will control the charge of the consumables, the food, the extra activities. With automated products, opt-out is managed slightly differently. Because this calculation is running in the background, you're not booking anything directly against the child's profile. Unlike on the itemized option, you can't simply deselect the product from the child. Instead, if we scroll down in this product view, we reach an allocation scenario. Now, in our case here, I've just set this to be billed solely on our example children today. But what typically would happen is you could either look to exclude based on child name. So if someone was opting out of this product, you could exclude the child by name here. So we could say this is being billed to everyone except Alice Copperfield, who's been opted out. If we think back to that earlier scenario I raised, we saw some settings, or we see some settings where they opt out based on funding type. So you could also bring in elements such as funding streams here. We could exclude certain funding types and say we don't want to bill this to any 2-year-old disadvantaged funder. So there's different ways that you can manage the opt-out based on whether it's an itemized product on actual sessions or an automated or annualized type element here. Our equal spread mechanisms work in a very similar way. We have still that same option for automation and annualization of charge, or the option to bill those product charges based on the actual sessions booked in the month. Almost a slightly different model of charging just the consumables versus the charged and funded hours, which would be equally split across the chargeable months. So let's look at the equal spread options now. Again, when we think about this scenario, we're starting in that system settings area on your platform. When nurseries bill on an equal spread invoice model, when they're in system settings and go to invoices / payments, we're looking here at using the generation type of equally spread. What you're in control of here is how many weeks you're charging your private hours across, the number of months you're dividing those additional private hour charges across, and then the same for your funding. How do you provide or deliver funding at your setting? Now, for a lot of our customers, they might be charging the session cost all year round, 52 weeks, because the nursery's open, of course, on that Christmas period in terms of payments for rent, for staff, etc. You might not absorb children on those days for childcare, but you might be open. You might only be allowed by your local authority to stretch funding over a 50 or 51-week period. But what we're able to define here is how we're identifying calculation charges for funding and for chargeable hours. So that when we look at billing the equal spread bill, we know for the year there are X number of charged hours, which we'd be dividing by 12, and there's X number of funded hours divided by 12 to arrive at that zero cost element. Let me show you that invoice once more. What you can see here is that the child here has 95 funded hours and 35 attendance hours charged. And that's their split or average. That equates to 130 total hours attended per month in the setting. And the idea here is that if the parent were to try to work that out themselves in terms of does that meet what we're actually attending, So the second page, the information page, can come into effect because we're highlighting that on any single week, the child here is attending 30 hours, and these hours are being calculated or charged over 52 weeks divided by 12. So if you did 30 times 52 divided by 12, you would equal 130 hours, which is the total shown across these two quantities. So it's presented slightly differently to the actual session invoice, of course, where we're showing that on this week, the child had 20 hours or 30 hours based on how the calendar falls. We're obviously calculating an annual element and dividing it equally across those months, splitting that charge across the months. So we have that segmentation. That calculation is driven solely by the invoice calculation factor and the funding calculation factor set within the system. The product setup is exactly the same as we've just shown for the automated or annualized element. So let me search once more in these products for eymeets. The elements that we see here that are set per funded hour, these work in exactly the same way for actual session bills as they do for the equal spread invoicing. On our equal spread invoice view here, we're simply saying that, again, these automated charges are being calculated as our funding per hour times 150 times £1 times 50p. As the month funding is equaling 95, we've got these equivalent 1.5, 1 and half charges here. So that process is exactly the same, both for creating the product and managing opt-out, as we've just shown, whereby within the product itself, if we edit this food charge element once more, we can build our calculation structure and manage the opt-out at the bottom here, typically using the exclude by child name or by different funding streams, etc. Those are the most common scenarios that we see. But one option which we offer, which is quite unique and used at some but not all nurseries, is the concept of an equal spread bill for the charging elements, but more of an actual session charge for the consumables. So that there's a clear evidence here in terms of where those products, those food, those non-food, those extra activities are being billed. Now, when using this sort of model, the key thing for an equal spread invoicing nursery is that they need to make a change to their invoice settings to accommodate this. In the invoice settings area, there's the option to exclude any products and services from being wrapped up into the annualized calculation. If we look to enable this setting, what that tells the system is that any product that we schedule against the child's attendance pattern, we're going to bill in an itemized fashion. Typically, this box would be unticked for most equal spread nurseries, but it's available for you to turn on if required. Let's look at that in practice. Let's come to our children view, and we'll search for our eymeets children here. Let's come to our equal spread invoice, child 2. Let's come to their scheduling view in this way. And you'll notice that the scheduling here looks very similar to the actual session invoicing child, whereby within the session type itself, we display any of those products, those consumable charges that we've linked against the schedule. So if you're looking to exclude products from that weekly calculation, when booking in that attendance pattern for the child, you would need to select the products in the way that we showed earlier, or link the products against the session type so they're auto-selected. Opt-out, therefore, in this scenario, if we're itemizing the product charge, is like on the actual session itemization opt-out. We would deselect the product if we're not billing it. The key thing here is that what this ensures is that when the system is looking at the invoice charge, we're still going to base the charged and funded hours on that week of the 6th of October, that sample week. But for the consumable charging, we're then going to look at each of the days in attendance and charge for each product in isolation. So in the case of breakfast, we can see it's on 5 Wednesdays, 5 Thursdays, 4 Tuesdays. So that ensures that we therefore bill for 14 of those products at the charge. Now, that's quite a rare scenario, but what it gives you is that concept of consistency on your chargeable hours, but evidence to the parents that products are based on the month in question. Some local authorities we know are looking for that sort of variance. Now, typically, most of you on the call will likely use one of those invoicing modules only. Either actual session billing, either equal spread billing. And then within those options, either the itemized or more of the annualized billing of the products. But the key thing for you guys to be aware of is that you do have the option to make changes for different children. So we do work with some nurseries, for example, where they bill non-funded children on an equal spread basis for that consistency of revenue, month on month for budget. Whereas once the child becomes funded, they then bill them on an actual session basis. So they're not banking funded hours now for future months or terms, assuming that the child will still be with them. We also see some parents where they ask for maybe an itemization of the bill you might want to accommodate. The key thing to consider here is that within those system settings, you have that main nursery invoice setting that we've already seen. But for any child on their own profile, you can adjust the invoice structure just for that child by editing the invoice settings that are shown on this view. So when we think about our invoicing process, by default, children will be billed as per our main invoice nursery system setting. But if we wanted to change and put someone on an individual structure, we could. We could enable an individual bill point for that parent. That ensures that whichever approach you prefer as a nursery, you've got that flexibility of variance if it's requested by a parent or to support a specific attendance structure or pattern, or local authority-driven guidance, of course. So the key takeaways in terms of how we support you from a DfE compliance perspective is that regardless of the model of billing you're using, actual session or equal spread, we allow you to provide that breakdown of product charging, either calculated based on the actual sessions booked in a month period, or automated as a charge based on some form of annualized charging based on funded hours or similar. So that when you present an invoice to the local authority for approval, when you present an invoice to the parents for their month-on-month billing, they get a clear breakdown of what you're charging for within that period, either based on a weekly structure breakdown as per the actual session bills, or based on an annualized charge with a supporting information page detailing how those annualized charges have been calculated. Now, in this structure, whether it's the actual session or the equal spread, the key element here in terms of the breakdown of the funded hours versus charged hours that we see is based on a couple of system settings. Someone just asked a question there, so we'll just show you those settings quickly. If we go to the invoices section first of all within system settings, what you'll find is that as you scroll down the page, depending on when you joined eyworks as a customer, you've got different invoice versions available to you. If you're an older customer, you would have initially been on our version 1 invoice layout. Newer customers got put onto version 2 by default. We encourage people to move across to version 2. Our version 2 invoicing gives the layout presentation that we've showed on screen today. So if your invoices look slightly different to those that we've shown today, do ensure that you set your invoice structure to version 2. And that will ensure you get that breakdown of charged hours, funded hours on the invoice to start with. And of course, if you then set up any of those products that we've shown, you would then have those product lines as well. That's everything we're looking to cover today in this session. So we'd like to thank everyone, obviously, for joining the call first of all. What we've covered will be sent across as a recording, along with a couple of our key Help Center guides, just in terms of those functions that we showed, how to set up some of those products, maybe set that automation up. That will be included with the recording we share, so that you've got direct access to refer to those guides as well. As you go through the process, if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to jump on our system chat directly to our support team here in Milton Keynes in our head office. We'd be more than happy to help as you adjust your invoicing structure or process as part of the DfE changes for compliance here. But as we showed, the aim really is for our system to support you in showing that breakdown of charged hours, funded hours, and those additional charges where need be. But thanks for joining this morning. Really appreciate your time. We'll get this video out to you along with those Help Center guides as soon as we can. So bye for now, and we'll see you at the next EY Meet session that we host. Thanks so much for your time.